The gun didn't fire the first time, and for a second I thought God had answered my prayer. But then Meredith Holloway looked down at it, blinked like she was annoyed by a broken kitchen appliance, and pulled the trigger again while my daughter Ava stood frozen at the edge of our driveway, her small hand shaking, her breathing uneven. The red HOA violation notice still crumpled in her fist, like this was all just another argument about lawn height instead of something that could end a life. And the sound that came out of that gun the second time wasn't a clean shot, but a violent metallic snap that echoed against the stucco walls of our suburban Phoenix neighborhood. And in that fraction of a second, when the chamber jammed again, I ran, because every instinct in my body as a father screamed that Meredith wasn't bluffing anymore. She wasn't posturing for control. She wasn't performing for the neighbors peeking through blinds. She meant to shoot my child, and the worst part wasn't even the weapon in her manicured hand. It was the calm on her face, the calm of someone who had convinced herself she was righteous, because for months she had told everyone that Ava was disruptive, that her therapy equipment on our front lawn lowered property values, that the wheelchair ramp I installed without HOA approval was an eyesore, that my daughter's loud vocal therapy sessions were disturbing the peace, and each complaint had felt ridiculous at first, petty even, the kind of suburban drama you ignore, until the fines started stacking up, until the warning letters turned into threats, until Meredith, president of the Cedar Ridge Estates HOA, began showing up unannounced, standing on our lawn with her clipboard like she owned the oxygen we breathed, and Ava, who has sensory processing challenges, would tremble whenever she saw Meredith's white SUV crawl down the street, because even children can sense when someone hates them, and Meredith hated what she couldn't control, and that was my daughter. And 3 days before the gun appeared, she had told me, smiling tightly at the community mailbox, that some problems need permanent solutions. And I laughed it off then, because who imagines that a dispute over a ramp and a medical swing set could escalate into attempted murder? But now, as I tackled Ava to the ground and heard the third click of that malfunctioning firearm, I realized Meredith had planned this. Because she wasn't screaming, she wasn't panicking. And she was adjusting her grip like someone who had practiced. And neighbors were finally stepping outside, drawn by the noise, and someone shouted, "Call 911!" And Meredith's husband, Daniel Holloway, ran from their house barefoot, yelling her name. But she didn't look at him, she looked at me, and in her eyes was something terrifyingly steady, like she truly believed she was defending the neighborhood from us, like my daughter's existence was a threat to her carefully curated streets. And I remember thinking how small Ava felt in my arms, compared to how big Meredith's delusion had grown. How a woman who once complained about mailbox paint color had escalated to bringing a gun onto my driveway. And in that suspended moment between chaos and consequence, I locked eyes with Daniel and saw horror cross his face as he realized this wasn't an intimidation stunt gone wrong. This was criminal. This was irreversible. And finally the sirens pierced the air, sharp and rising, and Meredith hesitated for the first time, her composure cracking just enough for reality to slip in, and she lowered the gun slightly but didn't drop it. And that's when Ava whispered something against my chest that made my blood run cold. She said, "Daddy, she told me yesterday she would make me disappear." And I knew then this hadn't started today. This hadn't started with HOA fines or ramps or noise complaints. This had started in private conversations, in small moments I hadn't witnessed, in subtle intimidation directed at a child who couldn't fully articulate what was happening. And as officers flooded the cul-de-sac and ordered Meredith to drop the weapon, she finally let it fall, metal clattering against concrete. But she didn't cry, didn't apologize, didn't even look ashamed. She just kept repeating that she was protecting property values, as if that sentence could justify pointing a loaded gun at a 12-year-old girl. And while they cuffed her, while neighbors filmed on their phones, while Daniel stood trembling on the sidewalk, I held Ava and felt a different kind of fear settle in. Not the fear of what almost happened, but the fear of what we had missed before this moment. Because guns don't appear out of nowhere. Hatred doesn't ignite overnight. And as Meredith was placed in the back of the patrol car, and she leaned forward and locked eyes with me one last time, and through the glass she mouthed words I'll never forget. "This isn't over. The police report would later say the firearm malfunctioned due to improper maintenance, but what it didn't capture was the silence that settled over Cedar Ridge Estates after Meredith Holloway was released on bail 48 hours later, because money moves differently in neighborhoods where everyone pretends to be respectable, and suddenly the same neighbors who had filmed her with a gun were whispering that maybe there was more to the story, that maybe tensions had escalated on both sides, and I realized the battlefield had shifted from my driveway to public perception because Meredith didn't return home ashamed. She returned strategic, and within days, anonymous complaints were filed against us, alleging zoning violations, noise disturbances, even fabricated claims of aggression, and I understood then that the jammed gun hadn't ended anything. It had simply changed her method, and what she couldn't accomplish with a trigger, she intended to accomplish with paperwork and pressure. And Ava felt it too, because every time a car slowed near our house, she flinched. Every time the doorbell rang, she froze, and therapy sessions became harder, not because of her condition, but because trauma layers itself silently. And Daniel Holloway attempted to apologize once, standing awkwardly at the edge of our property, saying he had no idea she would go that far. But apologies don't erase the image of a weapon aimed at your child. And in what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent my career as a federal compliance attorney, specializing in organizational fraud. And the moment Meredith was arrested, I began digging, not out of revenge, but out of survival, because people who justify violence often hide other justifications. And it didn't take long to uncover discrepancies in HOA financial statements, small transfers approved without board votes, landscaping contracts awarded to companies linked to Meredith's cousin, fines disproportionately issued to families with disabilities or visible medical accommodations. And as I pieced it together, a darker pattern emerged. Meredith wasn't protecting property values, she was protecting power, and power unchallenged becomes dangerous. And when I quietly presented my findings to two other board members who had grown uncomfortable with her behavior, their shock turned into cooperation, and a forensic audit was initiated, and suddenly Meredith's narrative of unstable neighbor began to unravel under documentation, and the same community that had whispered doubts started asking louder questions, and I watched the shift carefully. Because justice in suburban America often depends less on morality and more on exposure. And when the district attorney added weapons endangerment charges citing witness footage, Meredith attempted one final maneuver. She claimed the gun had been for self-defense, that she felt threatened by me, that she believed I was reaching for something, but body cam footage showed my empty hands. It showed Ava standing yards away holding nothing but a violation notice. And when that footage aired in court, the illusion cracked completely. And for the first time, Meredith looked uncertain, not because she regretted what she'd done, but because control was slipping beyond retrieval, and the final hearing wasn't dramatic. There were no shouted confessions, just the steady reading of charges, the quiet gasps of former allies, the judge's firm tone imposing restrictions, fines, mandatory surrender of firearms, and removal from HOA presidency pending criminal proceedings. And as she was escorted out, she didn't look at me this time, didn't mouth threats, because the narrative she had built had collapsed under evidence. And then weeks later, when a new interim board formally voided the discriminatory fines issued to our family and approved permanent accessibility accommodations, Ava stood beside me at that same driveway where everything had almost ended, sunlight warm against concrete that once echoed with a misfired weapon, and she asked if Meredith would ever come back. And I told her something I believe deeply now, that some people mistake control for strength. But real strength is standing your ground without becoming what tried to destroy you. And as the Holloway house eventually went up for sale, its pristine lawn suddenly irrelevant, I realized the most terrifying part of that day wasn't the gun jamming or the trigger being pulled twice. It was how close we had come to letting intimidation silence us before it escalated. Because evil in quiet neighborhoods doesn't start with gunshots, it starts with unchecked authority. And this time, when it pulled the trigger again, it finally faced consequences.